How's it going, guys? Nintendo Enthusiast here. Today I wanted to talk all about The Legend of Zelda Skyward Sword and why you should maybe check out the Switch version whenever it launches later this year. Now, this game is sort of strange because when it initially came out, critically it actually did pretty dang well. IGN actually gave it a 10 out of 10. But over time, this game has sort of become the bastard child of the 3D Zelda games. A lot of fans just simply do not like it, whether it's for the motion controls or the overall design of the game. A lot of people didn't like that. It's just sort of looked down upon nowadays, and I totally get it. It's by no means my favorite Zelda game, but I did actually enjoy my time with it back whenever I played it in 2011. And it's actually been 10 years since I last played this game, so I'm actually looking forward to playing it on Switch with the HD graphics and the more traditional control scheme. Without further ado, here are 7 reasons why you should play Skyward Sword HD. First off, if you're a Zelda nut like me, then you're probably a little obsessed with the timeline of the series, which is totally insane and honestly doesn't make much sense a lot of the time, but Skyward Sword is set in the earliest time frame of the Legend of Zelda franchise. And that factor alone I always found really interesting because this is the start of it all, which leads me to my number 2 reason. Skyward Sword delves into the origin of the Master Sword. Yes, the sword you've been using in every single Zelda game, Skyward Sword explains where the sword comes from and the power behind it. Of course, in this video, I'm not going to dive deep into story details because I know this will be the first time a lot of people are playing Skyward Sword, but I think the story elements in this game are really interesting, which leads me to number 3. This is the most character and story-focused Zelda game that there is. Link and Zelda actually grew up together in the same town, and they have an unbreakable bond, and it's really awesome how the game explores this. And I truly believe that Skyward Sword achieves at telling an emotional story, and what makes it even more impressive is that there's no voice acting in the game. All the emotions are portrayed through the anime-inspired characters and an amazing soundtrack. I cannot go without mentioning the soundtrack. It wasn't even on my list, but I had to mention it here. It's fantastic. Speaking of the game's presentation, Skyward Sword opted to use a more cel-shaded inspired art style, sort of combining the mature-looking characters from Twilight Princess with the overall cartoony art style from Wind Waker. And I honestly really like the blending of the two. Now, unfortunately, this HD remaster isn't going in and enhancing any of the textures. It's pretty much still the exact same game, just up-resed into 1080p or whatever. So that is a bit of a letdown, but thankfully the game uses an art style that actually ages pretty well. Thankfully, this time around, if you don't want to, you don't have to use motion controls. You can simply use the joystick to swing Link's sword. I'm interested to see how this feels. I do remember seeing the game running on an emulator a few years back where they basically did this exact thing, where they just mapped the right stick to the sword swinging, and Nintendo's doing the same thing. So if you're not into motion controls, you can definitely still play this game. However, I was kind of worried about the wording of this in the last Nintendo Direct. Nintendo kind of made it sound like you can't use traditional controls unless you're playing portably, and I really hope that's not true. I'm gonna go ahead and assume that's not true and that Nintendo just wants you to use the motion controls because that's how the game was originally intended to be played. But either way, at least you can use a traditional control scheme in handheld mode, which is a really big deal because the motion controls were a huge thing that the fan base did not like. Now, I'll be honest, I actually didn't mind the motion controls back when I played this game, and I'll probably play them again with the motion controls on Switch. I'm sure I'll switch back and forth between the two and see which one I prefer in the long run. The 6th reason why you should play Skyward Sword is that this was the last traditional Zelda game that actually had dungeons, which is pretty sad because I actually love the classic formula of Zelda games. Don't get me wrong, I really love what Breath of the Wild did to the series. It really changed everything we know about Zelda, and that has its ups and its downs, and one thing I really thought was lacking in Breath of the Wild was traditional dungeons, and thankfully they're in Skyward Sword. And it's possible that Breath of the Wild 2 doesn't even bring back traditional dungeons, so if that's something that you love from previous Zelda games but you never got around to playing Skyward Sword, I'm happy to say that they are in this game. Now, number 7, this is sort of a big one. Skyward Sword inspired Breath of the Wild and Breath of the Wild 2, and what I mean by that is, elements introduced in Skyward Sword are prominent in Breath of the Wild. The dash mechanic and stamina meter started in Skyward Sword, as well as the gliding. Not only that, but the latest Breath of the Wild 2 trailer shows Link falling from above the clouds to a land below in the exact way Link does in Skyward Sword. This leads me to believe that there will be some type of air travel in Breath of the Wild 2, so if you want to get a taste of that, you should definitely check out Skyward Sword. And on that note, it's seeming like Breath of the Wild 2 will have a great focus on time. I'm sure you saw Link use his new power to rewind time in the trailer, and there are even theories about the game taking place during 2 different time frames. And as you know now, if you didn't before, this is the very beginning of the Zelda timeline. So it's possible that story elements in Breath of the Wild 2 might just connect to Skyward Sword. Maybe it's not a coincidence that Skyward Sword is launching ahead of Breath of the Wild 2. I'm sure there will be some type of connection. I mean, this thing right here from the latest Breath of the Wild 2 trailer just screams Skyward Sword. And that's pretty much it, guys. Those are my 7 reasons why I think you should give Skyward Sword a shot. I think if you're a hardcore Zelda fan, then it's obviously a must-play game, but if you only played Breath of the Wild and you're fairly new to the series, I do think it's worth checking out, as this will give you some insight on the very beginning of the Zelda timeline. And that's all I have to say today, guys. Thanks a lot if you made it this far. If you enjoyed this video, hit that thumbs up. If you didn't, hit that thumbs down. And if you're feeling generous, hit that subscribe button, and I will talk to you guys later. See ya.